The kingdom of our God is a heavenly kingdom. The kingdom of our God is an eternal kingdom. The kingdom of our God is a united kingdom. On Monday, the leadership of our country will transfer from one president to another. Power will shift from one party to another. Some will rejoice, some will cry. There will be memes, I'm sure of it. When considered against the backdrop of the eternal reign of Jesus Christ, Monday's inauguration will be one of the most insignificant moments in all of history. Before this moment, kingdoms have risen and fallen. Before this moment, kings have come and gone. Before this moment, from the very first days of history, world superpowers have traded hands, shifted powers, adjusted borders, displaced peoples. Who cares? The kingdom of our God, Jesus Christ, will reign forever and ever. 2 weeks ago, we began a series in the book of Daniel. Daniel begins with a cataclysmic power shift. The Babylonians come and invade Judah. The Babylonians bring into exile a young teenager named Daniel, his 3 friends as well. The Babylonians, led by a ruthless pagan dictator, a guy named King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians take with them some of the precious and holy artifacts from Jerusalem's temple. And yet, even in that first chapter, we saw that it was not King Nebuchadnezzar in control. The Babylonians had the illusion of sovereignty, but God alone is sovereign. The Lord gave the king of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hands, the Bible says. And the text tells us in chapter 1, in verse 17, at the very end, or near the very end, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. By the end of that first chapter, we see an example of how those 4 Jewish boys demonstrate their learning and wisdom. But we haven't yet seen what the narrator says, that Daniel had understanding in visions and in dreams. That's where we're going to pick up in our text today. If you have your Bibles, please open to Daniel chapter 2. And if you need a Bible, please raise your hand. We're happy to give you one. We're going to start right at the top, and we've got a lot of text to work through this morning, so we're going to get moving. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 1. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Now, we ended chapter 1 3 years after Babylonian University began. 3 years of training for Daniel and his friends. But chapter 2 here picks up in the 2nd year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Now, there are 2 possible explanations for how these 2 chapters go together. It's possible chapter 2, what we're going to read today, is all a flashback. It explains how we know that Daniel was experienced in understanding visions and dreams. Old Testament narratives often flash back and they flash forward many times without any warning. But I don't think that's the best explanation here. Based on how this chapter ends, I won't spoil it for you, Daniel doesn't seem to be in training in this chapter. I think a better explanation is to recognize a difference in how the years were counted between these chapters. If you take a look at this chart on the screen here, in both Babylon and Judah, the ancient people often reckoned time using a bit of a different method than we were used to. The first year of a king's reign was sometimes called the accession year. The first full year of that king's reign was then counted as year 1 for that king. So in other words, if we're talking about the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, we might actually be referring to what we would call the 3rd year of his reign, which means Daniel and his friends would have been finished with their training by the time this chapter begins. So in my opinion, chapter 2 does follow chronologically after chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar gets a dream. He's sure that his dream is supernatural. He knows he didn't just eat some spicy Chinese Babylonian food the night before. He wakes up and he knows something unique has happened here. It's not a normal dream. And actually, the text even says he had dreams, plural. And throughout the chapter, it goes back and forth between dream singular, dream plural. Maybe it was multiple visions of the same dream. Maybe it was multiple parts that made up like a serial narrative dream. I know you've probably had things like that before happen to you. Maybe not quite as intense as what we see in Nebuchadnezzar. But he knows this. This dream is unlike anything he has ever experienced before. And he thinks he knows what to do about it. Verse 2 and 3. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. So here the king gathers his people. And just who are these people? These people are the who's who of spiritualists in Nebuchadnezzar's day. If we were writing this today using our terminology, we might use terms like palm readers, astrologers, witches and Wiccans, fortune tellers, maybe even dog whisperers, I don't know. But among this group, there's also the Chaldeans. The word Chaldean can be used in two different ways. Even within the book of Daniel, it can refer to a group of people from Chaldea, which is a place near Babylon, or it can refer, like here, to a class of priestly scholars who were skilled in those kinds of magical arts. Now, all of these things are strictly forbidden in the Old Testament by penalty of death. And yet Nebuchadnezzar gathers them to interpret his dream. And in verse 4, it says, Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. These guys are slick, aren't they? What's the advantage of hearing the dream first? Yeah, you can make up anything you want in your interpretation, right? My son Micah loves to tell us what his dreams were. He always has these wacky dreams, and he's coming out of his room in the morning, and usually it's related to something he did the day before, right? And it's very easy to interpret that kind of a dream. I can reasonably interpret it by saying you watched a weird YouTube video last night, right? Or you were playing with your toys, and the toy was in your mind as you went to sleep. Interpreted. Very easy. The Chaldeans, they want to hear the dream first. Then they'll give their so-called interpretation. They'll make it sound really good. But we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar's a little smarter than that. He knows this dream is unique, and he needs an actual supernatural interpretation of it. Now, before we move on, I want to mention something really special and unique that happens here in the Bible. Most of the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. The book of Daniel begins in the Hebrew language. But right here in verse 4, halfway through the verse, the language changes from Hebrew to Aramaic. Aramaic is a sister language of Hebrew. They're very similar, almost kind of like English and Latin, or English and people from Mississippi. Like, it's very, very close, right? I mean, they're almost exactly the same, but the language changes to Aramaic, and it actually stays Aramaic all the way to chapter 7, a big section of this book. Now, why? Well, Aramaic was the common language of the people back in Daniel's day. So during Daniel's time, what most people around the world spoke was that language, kind of like English is to most countries today, or many countries. There are a lot of possible reasons why Daniel's written in these two languages, but by opening it up to Aramaic, especially in these chapters, he's making them accessible to pretty much everyone in the ancient world. We're going to see in a minute that Nebuchadnezzar's dream does not just involve Babylon. It does not just involve Israel. It involves everyone. And now the entire world can read it because the language has changed. But getting back to the text, the Chaldeans, they want Nebuchadnezzar to share his dream first, but the king has a different plan. Picking up in verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation." Now, this is classic King Nebuchadnezzar right here. This guy does not mess around. You shall be torn limb from limb, he tells them. Notice he doesn't say, I'm going to kill you and then tear you limb from limb. The tearing of the limbs was the means of death here. To add insult to injury, your houses will be laid in ruins. And that's considerably more forceful in the original Aramaic. The word for ruins is literally dunghill. Your houses will be turned into outhouses, into cesspools. And this guy really wanted his dream interpreted and was giving them quite the motivation to do it, both the carrot and the stick at the same time. He wants them to tell him the dream first. That way he knows their interpretation is legitimate. And he's ready to slaughter them if no one is able to do it. Now, of course, this doesn't exactly calm down the crowd, does it? Because in verse 7, you could hear the panic in their voices. They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." The king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with the flesh." Now they get something right here. No one can do what the king is asking. Or at least no human being can do what the king is asking for them to do. I can't tell you what you dreamed last night. You can't tell me what I dreamed last night. It's ironic that these sorcerers and magicians and enchanters, all the people who are supposed to have the ability to connect with the so-called gods of the Babylonians, it's ironic that not a single one of them had confidence in any of those gods. None of them. In fact, they even admit at the end, we can't communicate with them. These gods don't dwell with people. It's almost like they're admitting that their entire religion, their entire occupation has been a sham all along. But at the very least, they recognize something that's true. No human being can do what Nebuchadnezzar is asking us to do. Only a God can declare and interpret dreams. Well, as you can imagine, King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like to hear this. He is not a man who is used to hearing words like no and I can't. So in verse 12, you can sense his rage. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. All right, so now we finally get back to Daniel. Daniel is one of these wise men. So are his three friends. Their heads are on the chopping block. In fact, the way this is written in Aramaic, it might be that the executions had actually already begun when word gets to Daniel. Arioch and his butchers were already tearing limbs from limb and were already making outhouses of the houses of the Babylonians. But Daniel's not just a good-looking guy. He's not just wise. He's also respectful and tactful. He recognizes what's going on. He asks for a few moments with the king. He's a model, I believe, of how we should be with our government, even when our leaders are not making the right kinds of decisions and are not exactly models of godliness themselves. But look at what Daniel does when Arioch gives him time. These next few verses are some of the key verses of this chapter. You don't want to miss this. If the magicians are correct, and if human beings cannot declare and interpret dreams, then how in the world is Daniel going to do it? Look at this. Verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we have asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Church, follow the order here. Daniel needs to declare and interpret a dream. It's a life or death situation. So what's the first thing he does when he gets home? He prays. He gathers his 3 friends and he prays, tells them of the situation and begs them to pray for God's mercy. He knows the situation is entirely in the hand of the Lord. If God does not answer, or if God says, I'm not telling, Daniel is a dead man. His friends are dead. The book ends right here, chapter 2. We're all done with this series. Church, I need you to see this right here. We're going to see this again and again, and then after that, we're going to see it again in Daniel. But we see it here first. The key to Daniel's success is prayer. Daniel is a man of prayer. How does a young teenager removed from his identity, stripped of his family, stolen from his land, kept from his religion, how does a young man stay true to God? Prayer. Many of you teenagers go to a public high school or public middle school. Now, I'm not saying that is Babylon that you are going to. You get to come home at night. Daniel didn't. But I am saying that there are a lot of similarities between the values, the morals, and the temptations of your school and Daniel's school. How can you be a godly young Christian in the halls of your public school when everyone around you is living a totally different life than you? Is it possible to be a Christian in that environment? If it was possible for Daniel to be a godly young man in Babylon, brothers and sisters, you have no excuses. Your excuses aren't valid in the book of Daniel. If you try to face that pagan culture, though, on your own power, you will fall into sin. You will apostatize and leave your faith. Christian teenagers, pray. Seek God's mercy that he might hear you. Get on your knees before school even begins day after day and ask the Lord to do a work in and through you. Parents, lead your children in prayer. Be a model for them. You think Daniel learned his religion when he got to Babylon? I'm going to guess Daniel had some pretty good parents back in Jerusalem first. But follow the order here. Daniel hears the executions. He goes home and tells his friends to pray. And then it says, God reveals to Daniel the mystery of this dream in a vision of the night. Daniel prays, God answers. And then what does he do? Daniel prays again. He praises the Lord for answered prayer. And what does he emphasize in this praise? What does he say about God? What you say about God says a lot about what you think about God. Notice what Daniel highlights in this praise report here. He says that God is the true source of wisdom and power. Daniel is one of the wise men of Babylon, so-called. But who gave him that wisdom? Daniel said it comes from God. At least 3 times in that short prayer, Daniel recognizes that God is the source of all true wisdom and understanding. God changes times and seasons, he says. He removes kings and he sets up kings. Let me translate that for you. God removes presidents and sets up presidents. God changes elections and political seasons. No election ever surprised God. No king ever comes to power without God appointing that king. President Biden is right now our president because God appointed him so. Tomorrow, President Trump will be our president because God appointed him so. Now, if you have a problem with that, remember that these words were written in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the king who slaughtered nations, the king who murdered mothers and their babies, the king who exiled sons with their fathers, the king who had no problem saying, I'm going to pull you limb from limb if you don't do what I command you to do. God appointed him. Now, it doesn't mean that God approves of all the things he does. Nebuchadnezzar will answer for his sins. Just like President Biden will answer for his sins. Just like President Trump will answer for his sins. Just like your boss will answer. Just like your teacher. Just like your parents. And just like you and I. God is sovereign over all human events and human leaders. Now, if you're wondering why would God appoint such a wicked ruler to the throne, keep in mind, God is using Babylon as an instrument of judgment against his people. Sometimes God allows the wicked to reign to give the people exactly what they've been asking for and what they deserve. That's a sobering thought in our time period especially. Daniel acknowledges that a God that powerful, a God who is this sovereign, a God that is able to set up kings and remove them, that God is worthy of praise, a God worthy of thanks. Now notice how at the very end of this prayer, Daniel transitions from speaking about God to speaking directly to God. And he stops speaking in the first person and he begins speaking collectively with his friends. He says, now you have made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. All four of them are praying. Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. And God answers and they praise the Lord for it. And now we're all on the edge of our seats, aren't we? This whole section here delays the events of this chapter. The noose is still around the neck of Daniel, so to speak, but we stopped the whole action for a prayer service. That's the point. In verse 24, we resume our regular programming and we continue forward. It says, therefore, Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Keep reading. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, come thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. What humility. Unlike Arioch, who tries to take credit for the whole thing, Daniel continues to provide a great example for us. The king asks, are you able to make known to me the dream and its interpretation? And the first words out of Daniel's mouth, first word is no. No. No one can. Daniel could have been like Arioch. He could have taken that credit. But what does he do? He says, I can't interpret anything. But I serve a God who does and who can. 100% of the credit goes to God. In America, we tend to have this I did it myself mindset. I worked myself through college. I fought to climb that corporate ladder. It was my blood and my sweat that went into paying off that mortgage, building that addition, advancing my portfolio. What if we had Daniel's mindset? Lord, you have given me all the wisdom and understanding to earn this degree. Lord, you have granted me success at my job. Lord, you have ensured that my children walk with you despite my own sinfulness. Daniel puts all the focus on God, takes no credit for himself. He can't interpret dreams any more than you and I can interpret dreams. Well, what exactly is this dream about? Daniel starts to give us hints now. He says in verse 28, his dream involves the latter days. Almost always in the Old Testament, that phrase latter days refers to end time stuff related to the Messiah. We're not talking about just a couple years after Nebuchadnezzar. We're talking about the end of the end, the coming of the Messiah and the return of the Messiah. But what exactly is the dream? We are 30 verses in, and we still haven't even heard the dream. Some of you are probably looking at your watches and wondering, is he ever going to get to it? Or are we going to even finish the chapter before Jesus comes back, right? Church, the design of this chapter is purposeful. The author is purposefully keeping us in suspense. He wants to make sure he gives us the main point before we get to the end time stuff. Because he knows us, I think. He knows, I'm sure, that churches one day will consist of a bunch of slobbering end times nuts who are only in it for the charts and the arguments. Sorry if I insulted you there. But that's not the point. I'm going to give you some charts. I'm even going to give you some arguments. I might even be slobbering myself for some of this. But the point of end times theology is not to ensure that we get every little detail correct and we make elaborate systems of theology and look down on people who are not within that system. The point of end times theology is to help believers live right now. As we anticipate the future, it changes our perspective on today. It motivates our way of life. It gives us something to hope for. It lets us know about the God who we serve. That's the point. So Daniel writes 30 verses before we even get to the dream. He highlights in those verses his own humility. He showcases God's sovereignty over all things, God's control over all things. He humiliates the pagan systems of belief. He spotlights the importance of prayer. He demonstrates how tactfully and respectfully to address a bad government decision. All of this before we get to the dream. Keep those things in mind as we read these next 5 verses. Picking it up in verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that's it right there. That was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Huge statue made up of all kinds of different metals. The metal gets less expensive as it goes down, starts with gold, ends with clay mixed with iron. Then a huge stone comes and just obliterates the whole thing. And that stone grows into a huge mountain which fills the entire earth. What is the meaning of this dream? Well, a couple things to keep in mind. We are reading prophecy here. Through Nebuchadnezzar's dream, God is making a declaration about the future. Prophecy is not prediction. Prediction is, I predict the Eagles will win today. That may or may not happen. You're predicting something that may or may not happen. Biblical prophecy, I prefer to use the term declare. It declares the future before it happens. The Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. The Assyrians will invade Israel like a plague of locusts. A man named Cyrus will send the Israelites home from exile and rebuild their ruined temple. That's prophecy. It declares before it happens. When we see prophecy in the Bible, how do we interpret it? Daniel's going to give us a lot of good examples of what to do, so let me just start with 1 or 2 pointers for you. When we interpret prophecy, the starting point is always the immediate context. Does the text itself give us any indication of how we're supposed to read this? Now, the good news about Daniel is that a great deal of his prophecies are immediately explained either by him or by an angel explaining it to him. Now, if the immediate context doesn't help explain it, we look to other scripture. We compare scripture with scripture. Do other passages in the same book help clarify the content? Do other passages in the Old Testament help explain it? Does the New Testament interpret it or apply it in any way? So those are a couple of the questions that we're going to ask as we work through this text. Now, thankfully, here, Daniel gives both the content and the dream because he doesn't want to be pulled limb from limb. So let's work through his explanation in a couple of verses at a time, starting in verse 36. Still Daniel speaking, he says, "This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. All right, now this is a good start. Daniel's explained to us very simply the head of gold. He says the head of gold represents Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar as a representative of Babylon. So I put Babylon up here next to the head of gold to explain that this is representing that. Now I put the dates 612 to 539 BC. I recognize that Babylon began a lot earlier than 612 BC, but 612 was when they conquered Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and that's when I consider the major transfer of power from one nation to the other. Right? So 539 is when the Persians overtook Babylon. We're eventually actually going to see that happen in the book of Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar represents the head of gold. The next verse covers the next two kingdoms, verse 39. So far, so good here. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So now we move on to the chest and arms of silver, and then the thighs of bronze. Each of these represent another kingdom. Who came after the Babylonians? Well, the Medes and the Persians did. I put them together on this slide. Notice Medo-Persia is the way I titled it. Some Bible teachers like to separate it. They put the Medes as the chest and arms of silver and the Persians as the bronze waist there, and then down below, the thighs of bronze, and then down below they put Greece over here. Now, I put them together. A number of reasons I put them together. I think the book itself tends to put them together, generally speaking. The Medes and the Persians, they kind of ruled at the same time. Medes were stronger first than the Persians, and the Persians were stronger than the Medes. But in Daniel 5, we're going to see the transfer of power happen, and it goes right from Babylon to Persia. So I think, in my opinion, this is probably the best way to outline this. But after Babylon comes the Medes and Persians. Then after them comes Greece, when Alexander the Great took the throne. We'll actually see him talked about later on in Daniel. And then look at the fourth kingdom, the legs of iron, in verse 40. Daniel says, and there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all of these. Now the fourth kingdom, I think, is Rome. When Rome stepped onto the scene, it annihilated all those who were before it. Rome was a world superpower for many, many decades and centuries. They were extremely strong, very, very violent, very powerful, like iron. So Rome is represented by these legs of iron. Now, so far, hopefully we're all together. That was the easy part. This is where things get tricky, because the next part here of the statue is the feet of iron and clay. And this is where Bible teachers tend to go two different ways. Look at verses 41 to 43, Daniel's explanation. He says, and as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage. But they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. Now, what exactly are we talking about here? Is this a fifth kingdom, something that comes after Rome? I put fifth kingdom with a question mark up here because that's the big question. Is this Rome itself? Those are the two main ways to interpret this. Some people think this is a continuation of the description of Rome. Daniel doesn't say, and then there shall be a fifth kingdom. Rome was represented by iron, and this kingdom is represented by iron and clay, so maybe this is kind of like a continuation of that description. It's very possible that that's the case. Now, the other major interpretation is that this describes a kingdom in the future, beyond Rome. Some people say it's the Antichrist kingdom, or the kingdom that comes right before the time of the return of Christ. Now, before I tell you what I think and why I think it, look at that description of this kingdom again. Let's look for some clues here. Three main descriptions that Daniel gives of this kingdom. First, he says this kingdom is a divided kingdom in verse 41. It might appear united at times, but it is as divided as something made of both clay and iron. Second, we see that this kingdom is partly strong and partly brittle. Verse 42. The iron represents the strength. The clay, of course, represents that which is fragile. And third, in verse 43, it says the kingdom will be composed not just of one ethnicity or one people group, but of mixed marriages. And those mixed marriages are not going to hold together. Even though perhaps some of the leaders of this kingdom forge alliances through those marriages with others in other countries, those alliances will not hold up. So it's a divided kingdom. It's a strong and brittle kingdom. It's an intermarried kingdom. Now, all of that could certainly describe Rome. In many ways, it does. But is it describing something beyond Rome? I think actually the next two verses help answer that question. Look at verse 44 and 45. The last part of Daniel's description here and explanation. He says, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure." So Daniel says at some point during this kingdom made of clay and iron, God's kingdom will take over. It's clear we're talking about God's kingdom here. No one doubts that. What's debated is whether this is describing God's kingdom in the here and now, the church, or if this is looking forward to the kingdom come. In other words, is this describing what began at Jesus' first coming, or is this describing what happens at his second coming? Think about what it says. Verse 35, we're told God's kingdom will destroy these other kingdoms until not a trace can be found. Verse 44, it says that his kingdom will break in pieces all these other kingdoms and bring them to an end. Verse 35, again, we see this kingdom becoming like chaff on the summer threshing floors. That's Old Testament imagery usually associated with judgment. Now, if you ask me, my personal opinion is that does not describe something that's already happened. This passage has not yet been fulfilled. There is an already aspect of Jesus' kingdom. It was inaugurated at his first coming, but this is talking about the total annihilation of all those other kingdoms, and I think this is primarily looking forward to that second coming of Christ, the not yet part of the already not yet kingdom of Jesus. There are still remnants of Rome and Greece and these other nations around today. Just a couple weeks ago, my family and I were able to squeeze in a cruise with Royal Caribbean right before we got back to the semester and the school year. We were on one of their older ships, and the entire ship was decorated with Greco-Roman art all over the place. Everywhere you went, naked statues everywhere, shielding the kids' eyes left and right. The influence of these cultures is still here. We can't say there's not a trace of them, so I'm not sure that this describes our present-day reality. Now, that being said, I do recognize that verse 35 describes this stone as something that becomes a great mountain and fills the earth. Perhaps it's a gradual process. Maybe we can say this kingdom began at Christ's first coming, but it does not complete what we see here until the second coming of Christ. I'm okay with saying that. But the primary fulfillment that we're looking at, in my opinion, I think happens at a future time period down the road. So let me bring all that together and summarize for you. Personally, I think the best way to understand the feet of iron and clay is that they refer to a kingdom that we have not yet seen, a kingdom in the future, a kingdom that will feel a little bit like Rome, but isn't. And when Jesus returns, he will obliterate that kingdom, and he will wipe away any trace of any man-made kingdom ever. There will no longer be Greco-Roman influences upon the world. Persia and Babylon and all their morals will be wiped off the face of the earth, and Jesus Christ will reign forever. Now, if you don't agree with me on these finer points, that's okay. I still love you. Hopefully you still love me. One of the strengths of our evangelical free denomination is that we agree on the essentials and we treat others with charity on the non-essentials. It is essential that we all believe and we agree that Jesus Christ will return one day. That's an essential element of our Christian faith. It is not essential to come to the same conclusion on feet and toes mixed with clay. That's not one of the tests to get into heaven. That's not one of the tests for membership here at Riverstone or leadership. I've been involved in churches in the past where to be a member or to be a leader, you had to believe this very specific lane of end times theology. And if you weren't in this very specific area, you couldn't be a member. I think that needlessly divides a church. As we get into some of these end times discussions in Daniel, I would urge you to show both charity and humility to each other. You don't know everything, so be humble in your opinions. Other believers don't know everything, so be charitable in the way that you interact with them, especially on these non-essential issues. As we go throughout Daniel, I am going to preach what I believe the text says. I'm going to show you why I believe that. Pastor Austin is going to do the same thing in his sermons. You are not only free, but you are encouraged to evaluate our opinions based on what the text says. And I'd urge you to do it based on the Word, not necessarily whatever denominational tradition you were raised in, not necessarily based on whatever confession that you hold to. There's a reason we pass out Bibles at the door and not the Westminster Confession or the Southern Baptist Statement of Faith. Evaluate us based on this. Those documents are good in certain things, but evaluate what we say based on this. Whether or not you agree with me on those finer points, hopefully we can agree that this is great news. The kingdom of our God is an everlasting kingdom. It is a heavenly kingdom. It is a united kingdom. Think about the impact of this message on King Nebuchadnezzar. He thought of himself as King of Kings. He thought of himself as sovereign over the whole world. I'm sure he thought his nation would reign forever. But that is not so. Daniel says there is a greater kingdom coming. This is a humbling message for him. God is humbling Nebuchadnezzar. He's letting him know everything that you have, I have given it to you. And I'm going to erase it all one day. My kingdom is heavenly, is united, is eternal. And the chapter ends with Nebuchadnezzar recognizing at least some of that. It says in this last paragraph, verse 46 on, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So Daniel and his friends, they get a promotion. Nebuchadnezzar even bows down to Daniel and pays him respect and honor. Just think about that when we get into next week's chapter, when that same king is going to require others to do that, not to him, but to a golden statue that he has set up. But Nebuchadnezzar's not all the way there, is he? He's not exactly a monotheist yet. Your God, he says, is a God of many gods. He believes Yahweh is number one, but number one among many. But at least he recognizes the Lord is number one. He's getting there, but he's not all the way there. And I suppose that this begs readers to ask the question, what about us? What about you? What do you believe about God? The way that you react to the inauguration tomorrow will reveal something about what you believe about your God. Is God the Lord of kings, the Lord of presidents? Do you believe he's the one who removes kings and sets up kings? Is Trump your God? Was Biden your God? Daniel is a man of God, and he gives us a great example to follow here. He's a man of prayer. He's a humble man. He believes in and he trusts the sovereignty of God. But the point of this passage is not be like Daniel. The point is to say something about the God of Daniel. God is sovereign. He is in control. He is King of kings and he is Lord of lords. He is the revealer of mysteries. He is the one who changes times and seasons. He is the one who causes nations to rise and to fall. Do not forget that as our nation changes hands once again tomorrow. Let's close by praying Daniel's prayer right back to God. God of heaven, blessed be your name forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. You change times and seasons. You remove kings and set up kings. You give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. You reveal deep and hidden things. You know what is in the darkness, and light dwells with you. To you, O God of our fathers, we give thanks and praise. For you have given us wisdom and might and have revealed to us mysteries in your word. To you, God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Thanks for being here. Just a quick announcement before you leave. In light of our snowstorm, we are canceling any activities held at the church tonight, youth group included, okay? So in light of our snowstorm, there will be no activities, but we do have muffins for you, so go enjoy those before the snow comes.